Good evening to those of you who are joining from Yerevan or in Europe. Good day to those of you in New York, and good morning to those on the West Coast in California. My name is David Phillips, and I'm the director of the program on Peacebuilding and Human Rights at Columbia University. And we're very pleased to organize this panel, which is part of a broader documentation project undertaken by Columbia called the Artsakh Atrocities Project. Our communications team will make the link available to you if you haven't already seen it. But we felt it was very important beginning on September 27th to maintain documentation of what had happened and also now to monitor the implementation of the agreement on November 10th, which includes several items, including the exchange of prisoners of war. Azerbaijan has not fulfilled its commitments under the November 10th agreement. Moreover, its actions have degraded prisoners of war. There are credible reports of torture in Azerbaijan, violating international humanitarian law and violating human rights. Armenia's representative office to the European Court of Human Rights has identified initially 240 cases of alleged prisoners of war and civilian detainees. According to Human Rights Watch, which is a definitive and authoritative source on this matter, so far 69 have been released, but Human Rights Watch identifies 60 who are still being held as terrorism suspects. I myself have seen a list of 160 POWs. We have decided not to publish that list because we're concerned for the safety of those people that are being detained. So first and foremost, we follow the rule, do no harm. So we want to respect the privacy of persons and their families who are at risk. Human Rights Watch has documented extensive violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. Prisoners of war have been subject to physical abuse and humiliation. This abuse has been captured on videos and widely circulated on social media. They depict Azerbaijani captors abusing prisoners of war, compelling them to kiss the Azerbaijani flag, to praise Azerbaijan's president Ilham Aliyev, and declare that Nagorno-Karabakh is Azerbaijan. This abuse of IHL is something that we'll explore further in our discussion today. Third Geneva Convention protects prisoners of war, quote, particularly against acts of violence or intimidation and against insults and public curiosity. Prisoners of war are also protected from torture in accordance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights. Azerbaijan's president Ilham Aliyev has said that Azerbaijan has returned all prisoners of war, and he's blamed Armenians for trying to claim that, quote, saboteurs were POWs. To unpack this matter and to provide further information, we have a blue ribbon panel joining us this morning. We're going to hear first from Arman Tatoyan, who is the human rights defender and ombudsman of Armenia. After Yerevan State University, he has a distinguished academic career at the University of Pennsylvania, at the Wharton School, and at the law school. He was elected to the Armenian parliament in 2016. Next, we're going to hear from Tamara Voskanian, who is a co-founder of the Center for Truth and Justice, which memorializes testimonials and crimes against humanity. Her organization is doing critically important documentation work. We're going to hear from Tamara about efforts to document crimes against humanity, not only of her organization, but others that are similarly engaged. We're pleased to welcome Professor Tom McDonald from Pace University Law School, who teaches international law, human rights law, and criminal law. He's written a very important book entitled The United States, International Law and the Struggle Against Terrorism, which is published by Routledge, which is also published one of my books. So we're very pleased that Professor McDonald is able to join us and shed light on the legal issues that provide context to this broader discussion. So in addition to providing information and raising awareness, we're also thinking about accountability. What do we do with this information? How do we make it actionable? And what can we do to mobilize support internationally in the US Congress and within the US government so that the perpetrators of violations of IHL are held to account? So we're going to have an informal discussion after the panel. We'll be joined by Van Krikorian, who's the co-chair of the Armenian Assembly of America and who monitors these topics closely. So this panel is the start of a discussion. We hope that there are items that we identify that Colombia's Artsakh Atrocities Project can pursue. Without any further delay, let's get into the discussion. We're going to start with Arman Tatoyan. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello to everyone, distinguished colleagues. Honorable Mr. Phillips, thank you very much for organizing this very important event and for your efforts in bringing to the attention of the public, to the professionals, especially the very pressing, absolutely urgent issue of the immediate release and return of all prisoners of war and civilians of the Armenian side, or Armenian POWs and civilians held captive in Azerbaijan, as well as this issue very closely concerns the problems related to the protection of the rights of missing persons and families of missing persons, since Azerbaijani authorities do not release the exact number of POWs. So all my report and all observations are based on the investigation of complaints that we receive from families and our monitoring and fact-finding activities that we have been conducting since the first day of the war. And I would here like, first of all, to stress that the absolute importance of international remedies in protection of the rights of these people and their family members. And it has also crucial importance to restore globally peace and solidarity in the Armenian society, to protect the dignity and prevent mental suffering, which has become a huge issue and the reason for tensions also in our society. Unfortunately, international human rights bodies and organizations have not been able to compel Azerbaijan to execute international human rights law requirements and to immediately release and return all captives, to refrain from hindering humanitarian processes related to missing people, and to put an immediate end on causing intentional mental suffering to the Armenian society. Nevertheless, we have been submitting continuously important information and reports to international many partners and trying to bring to their attention the exact content of the issue of the problem. One of the main issues that we have been facing from the very beginning is that Azerbaijani authorities have not been reporting, and they still continue this practice, the real number of civilian captives and prisoners of war. And by this, they have been also from the very beginning politicizing the whole situation and using apparently these issues, pure humanitarian human rights issue for political purposes. For example, according to credible sources of information, Azerbaijani authorities have already demanded control over roads of villages of Shosh and Red Market, in Armenian called Karmi Shuka, of Artsakh, and these roads directly lead to the city of Shushi for release and return of all Armenian POWs and captives. In other words, Azerbaijani authorities keep the prisoners of war and civilians. They do not release the exact number for bargaining purposes by presenting territorial demands despite imperative norms on the return of all captives after the end of hostilities. Another important thing is that another important fact that Azerbaijani authorities have been continuously violating human rights requirements of human rights bodies and international court instances. For example, the European Court of Human Rights, which is investigating cases of Armenian POWs, has highlighted that Azerbaijani government has been failing to respect time limits set by the court for the submission of information on the individuals, meaning POWs and missing persons, and also violating grossly the numbers and releasing the issue of releasing numbers, and of course the timeline related to the submitting the information to international instances. And another issue here, problem, is that Azerbaijani authorities, starting from December 31, 2020, they started to announce that they have that Armenian POWs are terrorists, are saboteurs, and basically they started this policy calling terrorists the 62 Armenian prisoners of war. They were captured from Shirak region, were captured from Khatsaberd in Nagorno-Karabakh or in Artsakh. And I have to highlight that this policy, then they continued this policy and eventually started to call all POWs terrorists and saboteurs. In difference with Armenia, I have to say that our country has transferred and released all prisoners of war, all of them. There are no prisoners of war in Armenia. And despite the fact that there was a principle all for the exchange, unfortunately, Azerbaijani authorities already, they have the policy, I mean, according to their official policy, they have no more POWs, all of them are terrorists. And by this, they launch criminal proceedings, artificial criminal proceedings, detaining these people despite the in gross violation of international mandatory human rights standards and international humanitarian law. And by these prosecutions, trying to, and then at the end, releasing judgments with sentences. Another very important factor here is that all these people were captured within an armed conflict. It is true that there are no hostilities at the moment, but the armed conflict, the Artsakh armed conflict, has not over. And according to international humanitarian law, these people are considered pure prisoners of war and captives, because we have there also civilians. Thus, they should be, the Azerbaijani authorities must immediately release them. It is absolutely impermissible also for us the interpretation by Azerbaijani authorities, the November 9 statement, or November 10, depending on how some people call it. I mean the trilateral statement on the ceasefire signed between the President of Russia, Prime Minister of Armenia, and President of Azerbaijan. A very apparent fact is that Azerbaijan, according to the official position, or it directly derives from the official position, that they have fulfilled and they have implemented all the requirements of this November 9 statement. But because they say, well, we do not have prisoners of war, it means that we have implemented, executed all the requirements, and other people, all other people are just terrorists. And I have to say that the behavior and the position means that as if this is the goodwill of Azerbaijani authorities, not to release the Armenian prisoners of war. But even if we did not have these provisions in this November 9 statement, anyway, they should have been obliged to release them, because these are the international human rights mandatory requirements. Another important thing is that this policy contradicts already the practice of exchange of prisoners of war and release and return of prisoners of war, because we had already cases when, after the signature of November 9 statement, the Azerbaijani authorities released and returned Armenian prisoners of war. Moreover, according to official position of Azerbaijani authorities, before, all prisoners of war who were sentenced, who were captured before November 9, all of them were transferred, and all those who are after November 9, they are already terrorists. But this is not true, because, as I said, we have already practices when they returned Armenian prisoners, when they returned and released them. Apart from all of this, there is already a practice when two parties exchanged formally convicted persons already. So, for example, Armenian side returned two persons who were convicted for murdering civilians in Karvajar several years ago, and consequently there is already practice, and the same was done by Azerbaijani authorities. So this is also a huge contradiction if we take the official position. I can also submit some figures. For the moment being, 103 persons were repatriated. So they were released and returned to Armenia. 45 still are officially confirmed by Azerbaijani authorities that they are in captivity as they call as terrorists in Azerbaijan. They're under investigation. According to our information, that we have there at least 165 people still remaining. At least we detected this. Well, this number is based on our monitoring that we count this number from the very first moment when we observed and fixed these people under the control of Azerbaijani authorities. So this is the first moment of these people being under the control. Unfortunately, Azerbaijani authorities have not confirmed to any of international organizations, Red Cross, European Court of Human Rights, and other international instances, that these people are still being held in Azerbaijan. But all the video materials and photos confirm that these people are were under the control of Azerbaijani authorities, consequently under the responsibility of Azerbaijan. Another important issue that very closely relates to the prisoners of war and generally to this issue is the extreme level, the very high level of hatred and Armenophobia in Azerbaijan, which is state-supported, state-sponsored. And I have to say that every time, every information, our monitoring clearly shows, every information about the prisoners of war, it becomes a subject for huge discussion in Azerbaijan with hatred and animosity towards these people. And we have been observing also this situation based on my reports. There are several evidence-based reports that confirm the existence of this phenomenon in Azerbaijan, which is direct consequence. It leaves direct consequences also on these people. Another problem that I have to highlight is, and this assessment is based on our interviews with prisoners of war, on our monitoring, that Azerbaijani authorities launch criminal proceedings and trial based on the statements or on confessions, so-called, of Armenian prisoners of war, whom they question in Azerbaijan. Then, based on these questionings, they launch criminal proceedings. Apparently, I have a special evidence-based report that shows that it is illegal and totally contradicts all international requirements to use these confessions for launching criminal prosecutions against these people. And what they do, basically, they with this evidence or confessions, they try to show that, or they show within criminal proceedings, that all Armenian servicemen came to Azerbaijan to commit war crimes, to kill Azerbaijani society, to kill women, children, etc. But there is no single evidence in reality, objective evidence. Even we have cases For example, the biggest group of 62 people who were captured from Khatsabert village in Artsakh, even there was not a single single shooting in this place when these people were captured. So, and moreover, there are no Azerbaijanis, there is no Azerbaijani population hundreds of kilometers, even even close to these places. So consequently, it is very important to highlight that anyway, under this huge threat of torture and threat to the right to life, of course, taking conventions goes across all international standards. Moreover, we know from international reports, and this has been confirmed also by our monitoring, the extreme level of torture and humiliation and ill treatment. By the way, this information we received also from captives who returned, because I personally had the chance to see all of them and to interview all of them, and all of them confirmed facts about severe torture, about humiliation every day, and inhuman treatment. Unfortunately, we cannot release this information publicly because it will definitely cause huge problems for people who are in Azerbaijan. That is why, but anyway, I published certain reports trying to somehow present this. I have to say that unfortunately, human rights protection mechanisms, international mechanisms in this issue, in solving the repatriation problems, were not effective, and up to now they remain not effective. And though we have certain statements from, for example, European Union, from certain countries, the European Court of Human Rights has stated this by applying to Committee of Ministers, but unfortunately this issue remains unsolved. And of course, we will continue submitting this, all the information, facts to international community, to international organizations, but so far the issue remains unsolved. And and Azerbaijani authorities continue to, with the trials, sentencing Armenian prisoners of war to 15, 20, I don't know how many years of imprisonment, without, it is even no sense of speaking about their rights during the trial. All of them artificial, apparently, just to show to international, as an excuse for international community. I'm more than convinced. But meanwhile, to use them in political negotiation processes, and as I presented already the case, such as, for example, demanding control over certain territories. And thank you very much for organizing this discussion. I want to express my confidence that this is one of the very important discussions that will certainly contribute to the positive solution of this issue.
Arman, thank you very much. I'm interested to learn that you've interviewed all of the returning POWs. On the Artsakh Atrocities Project site, we have a subpage on POWs, and we'd welcome those interviews or any other information that you want to be able, that you are able to provide to us, or that any of the panelists or participants can send to Charlie Randall, who is our content coordinator. I'm now going to turn the floor over to Tamara Voskanian, who is the co-founder of the Center for Truth and Justice. What we've seen from other fast-moving violent conflicts is the importance of preserving evidence, so that in the event there is a prosecution for war crimes in the future, we've been able to warehouse that information and make it available to prosecutors. Tamara, your work in this regard is critically important. You're also a part of a community of people that are monitoring and preserving data and information. So I'd like to commend you for your important work and give the floor to you now.
Thank you very much. Before I start, I want to say I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I really appreciate the work that your institute has been doing. I know you've been following the conflict since the very beginning. And I want to encourage everyone who's watching, also thank the people who are watching, that sometimes when this conflict or the aftermath of it is covered by non-Armenian institutions, I feel that is extremely valuable to expose our cause, and we really need more of that. So thank you for those efforts. So as you were saying, that's essentially, you just summarized what the purpose of the founding of our organization was, which was to memorialize the stories of war survivors in a secure database, essentially, so that we can use that evidence in the future for prosecutions or possibly for advocacy before legislative bodies or international organizations. And also, we're hoping that it will be used for court cases, potentially in international courts or in Armenia, in the US. There are some lawyers already looking at our evidence, and we make our evidence available once we're sure that it's secure to share. It's available to any lawyers that want to pursue legal action based on the evidence. So when the war started, myself, I'm an attorney in California, and I was one of the founders of the organization, which include a judge, a Superior Court judge, and other lawyers. And what happened was we started getting together during the war and saying, you know, what can we do? How can we use our degree and our experience to help while they're fighting there and dealing with all of that? Physically, we're here, what can we do to help? So we just started kind of unofficially gathering and trying to figure out what types of cases we could potentially put together. And then the war kind of suddenly ended in November. And so right then we said we need to start gathering this information from the survivors. So many people had emptied out from Artsakh into Armenia proper, and there was a lot of what I'll refer to as war survivors there. So we said, let's just start interviewing people and collecting the evidence. I'll tell you a little bit about our model. So we are working with the law schools in Armenia, and we're paired. So here in the US, our attorneys are what we call team leads, and we're paired with teams in Armenia that are doing the actual interviewing. They're generally law students, Armenian local law students, or newer lawyers. So we're paired on a very close person-to-person interaction. We prepare them for the interview. We provide them all the paperwork. We do mock interviews. We mentor them through the process of securing the interview and then actually conducting the interview. Then the team leads on our side watch the interviews, watch the videos, and then talk with the team leads about what went well, what can be done better next time, how was the documentation collected. We upload all the information. And then, so in that way, it sort of became not just a documentation collection project, but also a legal training project. Because what we realized was that the evidence collection tradition in Armenia is different, of course, from how it is in the US. And so we wanted to sort of impart some of what we're using, the methods we use here in the United States to our compatriots in Armenia, so that they can use the same methods when they're collecting evidence, when they're interviewing witnesses. So it's also partially legal training, how to manage a witness, how to interview a witness, etc. So what happened related to the POW issue was we've collected about 100 interviews, more than 100 interviews now that are on video. And a portion of those is with either returned POWs or the families of current POWs. We were doing an interview with one of the POWs, with one of the family members. It was actually the parents of a current POW. And this parent said, I learned suddenly through a media article in Russian media that my child is going to be tried in a Baku court like tomorrow or something. It was almost right away. She said, I didn't have notice. I don't know what he's being tried for. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. She sort of was completely in the dark about it. And so we started looking into the issue and realizing that even this is true now, there are no international watchdog groups monitoring these trials. And Mr. Tatoyan would know better, but I think there's been at least 40 trials and convictions. It's all been pretty quick. There's no even Azerbaijani human rights organizations monitoring the trials. And so my group started trying to get involved a little bit in the advocacy for making sure that there's some semblance of fairness in these trials. So we started submitting these trial watch alerts or requests to the Amal and George Clooney Foundation, just because we found them and we had a little in through one of our interns, and we figured might as well try it. We learned that they were interested in monitoring the trials, but what happened was when they were contacting human rights lawyers in Azerbaijan, they were being told the same thing over and over, which was, we're already under so much pressure as human rights lawyers in Azerbaijan, we cannot possibly risk also monitoring Armenian trials or even potentially providing counsel for the Armenians who are on trial. Because I don't know, again, Mr. Tatoyan would know better, but I don't know whether these people for sure have counsel or not. I'm not sure that any of us know. Because the countries have no diplomatic relations, we have a severe lack of information. So basically from that was about 2 months ago, I think, that we started that effort to sort of try to advocate for watching the trials, but also potentially secure defense counsel. And we have not been able to find anyone. Every Azerbaijani lawyer has said, I cannot risk it. So if an Azeri lawyer is not safe to represent an Armenian, then how could an Armenian possibly expect to receive a fair trial or, represent themselves? There are numerous cases of 20-year sentences being handed down. There's a couple also 15-year sentences. There's 6-year sentences, 4-year sentences, and then there's shorter sentences. Another very curious thing about the trials is that some people have been tried, convicted, and then deported. So what that shows is that, at least from my opinion, I would argue this in a court, that's strong circumstantial evidence that the sole purpose of the trial is for show, because there's no legitimate purpose if you're going to convict someone of a long sentence and then immediately send them out of the country where they're not going to serve the sentence. So these trials are extremely concerning. Anything we can do to shed light on them would be helpful. And I'm trying to think if I should tell you more about my organization, but I'll just wait for comments unless you have any questions.
Thank you, Tamara. I can add that the U.S. State Department Country Report on Human Rights in Azerbaijan has been very critical of the lack of rule of law in the country, which you've confirmed through your work and your observations. I also want to acknowledge that there's a network of individuals that are monitoring and recording violations of international humanitarian law. In this regard, Angela Tatoyan is working on an important documentary, and we look forward to making the documentary available through our Artsakh Atrocities project when it's ready. But Tamara, thank you for that presentation, which really sets the stage for a discussion about the legal context for all of our collective work. And to discuss this further, we're joined by a very distinguished law professor from Pace University, Tom McDonald, who's really one of the country's foremost experts on human rights and humanitarian law. Tom, the floor is yours. Look forward to hearing from you. Tom, you need to unmute yourself.
Thanks, sorry. I want to first thank my colleague Van Krikorian for recommending me, and for you, David, for inviting me to speak on this distinguished panel. What struck me about this case from a legal point of view is how clear it is. Okay? Sometimes, in fact, in dealing with the whole question of whether individuals who engage in terrorist activities are entitled to prisoner of war status, it's somewhat murky, okay? And there are arguments on both sides. Here, this falls squarely, in my judgment, within the heartland of the Third Geneva Convention of 1949. And I'd like to just talk about that a little bit. According to Human Rights Watch, Azerbaijan has been engaging in beating, prodding with metal rods, burning with cigarettes, using electric shocks against Armenian prisoners of war, not to mention ridiculing them, embarrassing them, putting them in positions which are sought to humiliate those individuals. Now, Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, okay, as well as Article 17, Geneva Convention 3, Article 17 of Geneva Convention 3rd, Article 87 and 89, all prohibit torture. So this conduct, in my judgment, clearly crosses into that threshold, In addition, as you were mentioning in your opening, Article 13 expressly prohibits subjecting prisoners of war to ridicule. And that is precisely what was done here. And I think we have to remember that Geneva Conventions of 1949 were formed and put together by the international community in reaction to Nazi Germany's treatment of POW civilians, okay, as well as Imperial Japan's treatment of POWs and civilians. And so this, again, falls right within the intent of the framers of those conventions. Now, one thing that perhaps your listeners who are not familiar with international law may not be aware, that every country in the world has ratified the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949. So that's 196 countries. That's actually 3 more than the number of UN members. Okay, there are 193 members of countries who are members of the United Nations. So this has, widespread support, and these violations, I think, are quite clear. So that's a matter of international humanitarian law, which another term for it is the law of armed conflict. Aside from that, okay, these are clear violations on the part of the Azerbaijanis of international human rights law, as Arman Tatoyan, quite eloquently put it. But I'd like to, dig a little bit deeper. Article 1 of the UN Convention Against Torture, as its name suggests, prohibits torture, okay, and cruel and inhuman treatment. Article 7 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights prohibits torture and cruel and inhuman treatment. And one thing, and again, this behavior clearly falls within the parameters of these conventions. Another thing that I think I want your listeners and viewers to note is that human rights treaties, by the way, we don't have universal acceptance of these 2 conventions. But the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has 173 states parties, and the Convention Against Torture has 171. That's not quite unanimous, but it is a super majority of countries that have accepted these critical treaties. And the other thing that's important to recognize is that both of these treaties permit, in times of public emergency, such as warfare, for the members who have signed and ratified these conventions to have somewhat lesser obligations because of the public emergency. So, for example, perhaps a trial might be delayed because of the public emergency. It may not have to occur in the normal course. However, there are certain obligations that are called non-derogable, that may not be done away with, may not be relaxed during times of public emergency, including warfare, and they are, in the case of the Convention Against Torture, torture may not be derogated from during times of armed conflict, nor in the case of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, not only torture, but cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment may not be derogated. So these are what I tell my students, super norms. Okay? And the evidence is quite strong that Azerbaijan has violated these. So we have violations of both international humanitarian law, okay, the law of war, and at the same time, international human rights law. Now, to go to the second set of issues, and that is regarding the return or the failure to return POWs. As your readers, I'm sure, just know that there's an obligation to return POWs when hostilities cease. But specifically, it's Article 118 of Geneva Convention 3 that so provides. So that each POW shall be released and repatriated without delay after hostilities have ceased. That's essentially the language of that provision. And again, this is a pretty clear case that this has not happened. And I should also add that the ceasefire agreement, I would like just to quote it for your readers, okay, and listeners, excuse me, I should say, and viewers. And Article 8 of the agreement states as follows: the parties shall exchange POWs, hostages, and all detained persons and dead bodies. So that comports with Article 118 of the convention. So what we have here is a clear violation of, apparent clear violation of international humanitarian law with regard to the failure to release prisoners of war. Now, there isn't a major exception. And the major exception is if a POW commits a war crime, well, then the power holding that individual has the right to try the individual for a war crime. And we think of war crimes the most typical war crimes, although there are several, are intentionally killing civilians, like, for example, Lieutenant William Calley did in Vietnam. Okay, he intentionally killed innocent civilians. He was convicted of that. Or aside from intentionally killing civilians, intentionally killing POWs, people who are now unarmed and are prisoners, and killing them. Okay, those are the most typical types of violations, although there are others. Okay? So now we turn to the allegation, as I understand it, both from the reading and what Arman Tatoyan has just mentioned. Okay, that Azerbaijan is alleging that these POWs have engaged in terrorism. Well, terrorism is kind of a broad term, and it is not a criminal offense, terrorism. Okay? It's really a hard defense it's really hard to kind of pin down exactly what terrorism means. There are definitions, I go into great detail in my book. But what's relevant here is the question is, did these individuals commit a war crime? Okay? And did they intentionally kill civilians, okay, right, for example, or as is alleged, were they saboteurs? My understanding is, and again, this is an area that's relatively new to me as far as this dispute is concerned, that we're involved with uniformed combatants, so that the Armenian, POWs were wearing uniforms at the time. So saboteurs requires that they be ununiformed. Okay, it doesn't, so the sabotage is kind of a strange, okay, device to use. But aside from that, okay, even assuming that an allegation were true, which I am not conceding, but even assuming for argument's sake that there was a valid allegation of some, or several Armenian POWs committing war crimes, they have a right to a fair trial by an impartial tribunal that amounts to a regularly constituted court. Okay? So as the last speaker just indicated, that means there's a right to choose one's counsel. Okay? You cannot deprive an individual POW or a civilian detainee, for that matter, of a right to counsel. And there has to be, the tribunal has to be fair, it has to be independent, okay? It can't be, something like a slam dunk for conviction. Likewise, just mentioning one point, and then I will conclude, and that is that confessions are quite suspect in this process. Under Article 17 of the Geneva Convention 3, okay, a prisoner is only required to provide, name, rank, serial number, and date of birth. That is all that a POW is required to reveal. And the idea that confessions form the basis of the claimed war crime charges raises very, great suspicions as to whether or not these were fair interrogations and whether or not Article 17 was violated. There are several international tribunals, okay, that may be invoked here, and perhaps in a question and answer, we can discuss those. Thank you. I can't hear you, David.
Thank you very much for that information, which really tees up a discussion about what is actionable and how do we establish accountability for the alleged crimes that have been committed against civilians and POWs. Van, why don't you get this discussion started by sharing some of your views? Before you do, I want to note that we have a comment from a gentleman in Argentina who notes that lawsuits have been filed with an Argentinian court. So there are remedies both at the state level with multilateral agencies, but also we want the US government and the US Congress to be more fully involved. And no organization is better at working on Capitol Hill than the Armenian Assembly of America. And we're joined by its co-chairman, Van Krikorian. Van.
Thank you, David. And in light of the time, I will be brief. Everybody should understand that I would profusely thank them otherwise. In terms of accountability, it's a difficult problem for a couple reasons. Not only the classic one of human rights law being an area where there are rights, but often the remedies are difficult to enforce because of the jurisdiction and the problems with enforcement. So here I'd like to start off with who should be accountable. And in that regard, the president of Azerbaijan is the prime person who should be accountable. And I will say that Colombia's atrocities websites identified other people who should be accountable in terms of perpetrators of atrocities. But what occurred and what is clear to everybody, including the United States government at every level, and NATO countries and CSTO countries, that the Erdogan regime in Turkey is equally responsible. So rather, in fact, Mr. Tatoyan did an excellent job in discovering and broadcasting a video of the president of Azerbaijan discussing the holding of POWs as hostages to extract concessions directly with President Erdogan's wife. That kind of evidence is impossible to get in most cases, but here we have a clear admission and advice that you should hold these POWs as hostages to extract more from the Armenian side. Don't give them all up at once. You did a good job extracting some concessions. You can get more. The accountable people have to also include the Erdogan regime. In fact, they're not just direction, but participation in the war is increasingly not only undeniable, but also at levels that we could only imagine, including using NATO resources, which is a real problem. That is an area where the United States has to get more involved, and certainly from President Biden, Secretary Blinken, Congress, we've got almost unanimous support. Congressman Schiff introduced HRS 240 calling for the release of the hostages or the release of the POWs and urging that the Minsk group get more involved. And well, Professor McDonald is exactly correct. There's a slew of international organizations that we could look at success in terms of dealing with what are really urgent situations, because these people are being held illegally and being tortured now. So what's the best way to achieve accountability and also to change their lives to the positive? And that, it occurs to me, is the one system which Azerbaijan and Turkey and Russia and the United States and the European Union and the United Nations had agreed to, and that is the OSCE Minsk group, which since the war and even during the war, Azerbaijan has tried to eliminate. But again, United States, Russia, and France are holding increasingly firm that that's where that work has to continue, because it has been charged by agreement to resolve the conflict, not only with respect to Nagorno-Karabakh, not only including Nagorno-Karabakh as a party, but also across the Armenian-Azerbaijan borders, which are an intense problem. I was there last week and saw firsthand what was going on, and am truly shaken. From 6,000 miles away, and with the benefit of our historical experience, it is quite clear that President Aliyev has never kept any agreement that he's made on ceasefires or anything else, any kind of confidence building measure. And that kind of breach of agreement makes you wonder, well, why would anybody enter an agreement that wouldn't be otherwise enforceable. And that Minsk group needs to play a greater role and a more critical role, including the US and France getting increasingly involved. And we're glad to see President Biden echo that. I'll just make a couple other quick points. Understand this is not a comprehensive review of our advocacy efforts, but first, it's also an awkward situation. While Mr. Tatoyan is the human rights ombudsman of Armenia and does work for Nagorno-Karabakh. Nagorno-Karabakh does not have a seat at the United Nations. It was recognized from the start as a party to the conflict in the Minsk group process, but its voice needs to be heard as well. In fact, with the Russian peacekeepers essentially taking over there is an information blockade, and the ability to get journalists to Nagorno-Karabakh is seriously compromised. Whereas Azerbaijan controls the journalists and controls what's seen. I thought the comments from Tamara about the restrictions on human rights lawyers there was very good and very clear and needs to be taken into account. In addition, we have said this from the beginning, the role of corporations invested in Azerbaijan and in Turkey has been extremely negative. They need to show some real corporate social responsibility, and they too need to be accountable for making profit in a country that is treating human beings the way these human beings are being treated. I will stop there actually, because I see we have only 7 minutes left, and I'm sure we're going to want to get some questions in there, but I do want to thank everybody and thank David and Columbia for this important one.
So thank you, Van. You've talked about Turkey's involvement in the conflict. It's well documented that Bayraktar drones had a huge impact shaping the battlefield. But I also want to note here that Turkey systematically deployed mercenaries and jihadists from Syria and Libya to the battlefield. And those mercenaries were responsible for war crimes, including torturing and beheading Armenians in Artsakh. So any investigation into this needs to include Turkey's command responsibility and Turkey's involvement as a state sponsor of terrorism by deploying its mercenaries from Syria to Artsakh. We have a lot of feedback in the chat, including some feedback from Azerbaijani interlocutors who are seeking a platform for their disinformation. We have a limited amount of time, and we're going to focus only on the alleged crimes committed by the Azerbaijani side. Before we conclude, let's return to our panel and get some comments from each of them. Professor McDonald, you probably have some feedback to Van's remarks. We'll start with you and then go to Tamara and Arman.
Yeah, well, actually, I think I'd like to respond to one of the Q&As, questions of the Q&A about, what is the point of the Geneva Conventions if there is no enforcement mechanism to find AZ responsible for war crimes? And I think the answer to that is a couple of things. First of all, I noticed that neither Armenia nor Azerbaijan are parties to the International Criminal Court, nor is the United States, as you know. And it is true that there is no official mechanism to enforce the Geneva Conventions. International law is generally enforced through a sense of enlightened self-interest and reciprocity. So I think the way to enforce it in this case is going to have to be galvanizing world opinion to stop these types of abuses. I think that's going to be the main, and perhaps involving principal actors like the United States, perhaps Russia, to help intervene there rather than there being a court mechanism. I would note that this dispute is within the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights. Okay. So I expect that there will be some type of decision of the European Court of Human Rights on these issues. It is also, I just want to point out from an international point of view, it is also within the jurisdiction of the UN Human Rights Committee. Interestingly enough, both Azerbaijan and Armenia are parties to the optional protocol for the UN Convention Against Torture and the optional protocol for the UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So both of those committees have quasi-judicial authority to look into this matter. Now, again, they require essentially it's a matter of galvanizing world opinion. Their decisions, do not carry a specific enforcement mechanism, but it is a way to galvanize world opinion, and it is a way to actually persuade, the governmental officials in Azerbaijan to act appropriately. One can't guarantee success in that, but those are the mechanisms from an international law perspective that are clearly available.
Thank you for pointing out that when we think of accountability, it includes legal action, but it also includes raising awareness in the International Court of Public Opinion. And this panel, in the work of our Artsakh Atrocities Project, is intended to address both those opportunities. Tamara, let's hear your final thoughts.
Thank you. I wanted to mention regarding the drone attacks, Mr. Krikorian mentioned, our group has collected some evidence from victims of drone attacks, and we are looking to provide that information to attorneys in the US and/or other countries that may want to use that information to file cases. There's potential for suing drone manufacturers, providers of the services for the streaming of the drones, et cetera. So I'm not going to pretend to know too much about that, but that's what our group is doing, is sort of gathering those things so that people who want to use it can go forward with those. So if anyone wants to work with that, please contact our organization. I put the information in the chat. I wanted to say that while in the scheme of the world crises, all the crises around the world, this may sound small to some people, that there's potentially 200 or less detained Armenians in Azerbaijan. But from our perspective, these people have been illegally detained for 9 months. Under international law, they needed to be immediately released. They cannot be prosecuted. All these prosecutions are highly illegal and fly in the face of all international law. And frankly, we all know this, and everyone knows it. So we need people to pressure Azerbaijan. We need more leverage. We need diplomacy. We need everything. That's why I was saying, anyone here who's watching or who's even on the panel helping to do that, that's very important work. Mr. McDonald, I don't know if you'd be interested, but my group is all lawyers in the US, aside from one judge, and we actually have people from outside the US as well. But none of us are actually international lawyers. We all come from all different types of law, and we do have some international lawyers that we consult with regularly, but we're always looking for more consulting. So I'd love to have your advising or any of that. We're sort of just gathering all efforts, and we'd love to hear from you. What else did I want to say? Right. We're starting a new semester, just really quickly, I'll mention this. We're starting our next group of interviewers in September. And so these are local Armenian law students, and we're going to be mentoring them again from the US side. So anyone who wants to get involved on either side, or if you know someone who wants to get involved, please let us know, because we're always welcoming new people and recruiting people that want to help in this effort to not only collect this evidence, preserve it, use it for legal action, but also to train the future lawyers of Armenia so as to strengthen the Armenian legal system, which is not just about what's already occurred in Armenia and these crimes that have already taken place, but about how we can better Armenia's legal system going forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you,
Tamara, thank you for that. Colombia has been contacted by the Syrian Democratic Council, seeking assistance in documenting crimes committed against Kurds and Christians and others in northern Syria. And we're pursuing that technical assistance, and we may revert to you and seek some of your expertise in working in other situations beyond our side. But thank you for your good and important work.
Thank you.
Arman, Tatoyan, the floor is yours and for final words.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted to conclude by highlighting, trying to highlight several important points. But first of all, I have to say that my office, we have documented with our very limited resources, our office, all the evidence and reports on these war crimes. And we have identified all countries that have general jurisdiction, and we have sent reports to the criminal prosecution authorities of these countries. This is, for example, Belgium, this is Greece, this is Argentina, and some other countries. And all of them are evidence-based and fact-based. And I have to say also that I have just posted the link in the chat of my very specific of one of the latest reports on the treatment of Armenian POWs and captives by Azerbaijanis. And we have there the Azerbaijani armed forces. We have their detailed analysis based on the facts. I intentionally didn't touch upon a legal part of the presentation because I left for for the distinguished panelists. But in this report, you will find exact analysis based on concrete facts. And as Mr. Krikorian said very rightly, we have documented evidence such as, for example, conversation between the president of Azerbaijan and the first lady of Turkey. This conversation took place during the trip of the president of Turkey to Shushi, when in the car, in the minivan, sitting in the minivan, that they were discussing the current state of the related to the prisoners of war and discussing the possibilities. Kind of the first lady of Turkey in this video is advising the president of Azerbaijan to exchange the prisoners of war part by part or in portions, let's say, and to exchange them, to keep them in order to use them for example, exchange of these people with certain maps. Ms. Voskanian spoke about the trials. Again, I didn't touch upon this issue, but I want very briefly to elaborate on this. These people have their state-paid so-called lawyers. Unfortunately, of course, they don't have there are no international observers, kind of objective people, etc. When it comes to protection of these people, for example, by Armenian diaspora lawyers or some Armenian lawyers here in Armenia also express their wishes to go and protect, to undertake the protection, legal protection of these people. I have to say that here we have to be very careful not to legitimize the legal trial, because the whole legal trial is very artificial. It is, there is also an ongoing trial before the European Court of Human Rights, and the admissibility criterion for this trial is that there are no possibilities or remedies for the protection. This is one of the admissibility criteria submitted to the European Court, and it is very kind of sensitive and dangerous. If Azerbaijani authorities definitely will do everything to show to international instances that they provide every possible measure and the possibility for the protection of these people, and they enjoy all the remedies, including international protection. Even if these lawyers come and criticize Azerbaijani authorities, it automatically may mean that the process is generally legitimized. So I'm just raising, let's say, I'm putting a question, let's say, for discussion or for thought, because this is apparently very important. And for example, I know that the lawyers of these people who are advocating before the European Court of Human Rights, they see huge concerns and risks in this kind of processes. Of course, it is different to have international observers, kind of such as Human Rights Watch, etc. But a different thing is to have a concrete lawyer or advocate for these people, just trying to specify. And I want also to greet our colleague who is doing a very important job, Miss Luciana Minasian. She's here from Argentina. I saw her question. She has been very active, and she was very active during the war and helping us with documenting evidence and submitting to certain instances. So thank you very much again, Mr. Phillips, Mr. Krikorian, Ms. Voskanian and Mr. McDonald for all these very important interventions. They were apparently useful also for me. And of course, I express my willingness to provide further any information, evidence, documents, because I personally had the chance to interview all these people, and we can provide from the first hand, so to say, information to all of you if need be. Thank you.
Arman, thank you for offering to provide those statements and other evidence that you've been gathering. Colombia's Artsakh Atrocities Project is really about research and documentation. So we welcome from you or any of the panelists or any of the participants materials that you want to provide to us, which we can make available publicly. It's important that we document what happened, not solely for the purpose of bearing witness, but for taking action. In Colombia, in consort with Van Krikorian and the Armenian Assembly and its network of friends who are concerned about the situation in Artsakh, have been involved in advocacy. We plan a conference on the 1-year anniversary of the start of the war, September 27. And I just want to pledge to each of you our continued vigilance as witnesses to the crimes that have been committed, but also our strong commitment to taking action, not simply raising awareness, but making sure that the perpetrators pay a price. So with that, we're going to adjourn our session this morning. Thanks to the panelists, thanks to the audience and the participants, thanks to my staff who worked on this, Jack and Charlie and others. We have a lot of work to do. We will stay engaged and we'll do our utmost to make sure that the victims are memorialized and their stories are retold. So with that, we adjourn. Thank you all. Wish you a good day or a good evening.
Thank you.